Okay.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for having me here today. Thank you to the IGC Pakistan office for setting up this the video system. I'm sorry I couldn't be there in person. I'm actually in Indonesia with a group of Yale students. I teach a class traveling around Indonesia with them, and so it was impossible for me to leave them in the rainforests of Sumatra and come and be there with you in person. But as I mentioned to the organizers, Lahore is a city where my parents met, so I was really looking forward to this. And hopefully next time I'll be able to be there in person and see my parents' old haunts. So I'll get right to it. So I'm going to be talking about a project on using social incentives, leveraging social incentives to incentivize firms in Bangladesh to pay VAT and become more VAT compliant. So this is an environment in which stick-based methods, so getting people to pay on the basis of, say, enforcement, audits, penalties, and fees, these are quite infeasible given the context. And so against that backdrop, we're collaborating with the Bangladesh National Board of Revenue to figure out if we can leverage firms' interest in getting social recognition for good behavior, for being VAT compliant, as a way to encourage them to pay more. So this is a collaboration between the Bangladesh National Board of Revenue. So two of the past and the current chairman are on the list of principal investigators, and a collaboration between NBR and a group of researchers from Harvard and Yale, namely Raj Chetty, Monica Singhal, and myself. And this is a project that was facilitated by the IGC. The original conversations happened in the very first growth week in London, and also since has been funded by both IGC and JPAL. Okay. So the general idea here, at a very broad level, is to provide some social recognition to firms. I'm providing you the examples of what we'll ultimately implement, or what we have implemented. It's these cards that look like, airline frequent flyer cards, but take the form of like a plastic credit card, and kind of a silver, bronze, gold level cards that allow firms to both display it in their at their stores, as well as maybe carry it around as a way to maybe go with in their meetings to banks, because as one way to establish their credibility and formality. Okay? That the NBR has recognized them as a gold level taxpayer. Okay? So we're going to do this, and we're also going to do some peer recognition on the basis of letters, just publicizing people's information to each other. So this is going to be the general idea. Okay? Now, why was the NBR so interested in this particular problem? It turns out that tax revenue collection is extremely low in Bangladesh. So this graph shows you that there is a positive relationship between GDP per capita and tax revenues to GDP ratio. And Bangladesh is poor, and therefore that's one reason why tax revenue collection is low. But Bangladesh is actually a negative outlier on this regression line. And so even where its GDP would suggest it should be with respect to tax revenue collection, it's much lower than that. And this has important costs for the economy. So infrastructure provision is very problematic in Bangladesh, in Dhaka in particular. So Dhaka accounts for over a quarter of the country's GDP, and it's now rated as the worst place on earth to live by the Economist Intelligence Unit. So for the past few years, Dhaka has been at the top of this list of worst places on earth to live. And this comes from partly infrastructure failures. So these are pictures from Dhaka on what the traffic looks like. So one way a friend of mine describes Dhaka or Bangladesh to you is it's as if a football game just ended and everybody's pouring out of a stadium. So that's what Dhaka looks like at all hours at any given point in the city. And the issue here is that infrastructure, so road transport infrastructure, has not kept up with the huge growth in both the country's economy and the population, and the city's economy and the population. And beyond roads, there's also electricity problems. So Bangladeshi firms are huge positive outliers in terms of the number of outages they face. They actually report facing more than just about 2 outage per working day. And this is among the highest in the world. Okay? So without tax revenues, it's hard to have revenues for infrastructure provision, and I think that's part of the big cost here. Okay, so why is it that tax revenue collection is so limited? It's that enforcement capacity is very low. So these are pictures from the circle offices of the Dhaka South Commissionerate, which is our primary implementing partner. And records are not really kept in a very sophisticated, modern, digitized manner. As you can see, these are files and ledger books that like reach up to the ceiling. So it's even hard to figure out exactly who's paying, who's not paying, who is registered, who exists at a firm. And as I'll show you later on, there's a lot of turnover, a lot of informality in the system, right? So records are kept in these books, and it's really hard to enforce on the basis of sort of incomplete records or unorganized records. That makes it very difficult for you to identify firms or identify payers. And against this backdrop, the National Board of Revenue, to its credit, has been trying to use lots of innovative mechanisms to try and encourage people to pay more. So it turns out enforcement is also difficult because retailer associations have a lot of clout, and even relative to, say, inspectors of the government, tax inspectors that the government hires. And the innovation, so we need some innovations to circumvent these kinds of governance challenges. And in this case, here's one example from the Daily Star, national newspaper. So it turns out the NBR publishes lists of the top taxpayers, the 10 or 5 to 10 top taxpayers in the country, and they're publicized in the newspapers, they get recognized. And our general idea here is to sort of scale this up and do it in a way that permits rigorous evaluation, these types of ideas. And we're going to be careful about doing sort of something about peer recognition, but also an intervention that facilitates not just recognition, but also peer monitoring and pressure in order to pay. Okay. So when traditional punishment-based methods are not feasible, our general idea is, can we leverage interest in social recognitions to stimulate tax payments? Okay? So the type of things you should be thinking about here are things that are cheap for us to provide, but might be deemed very valuable for firms. So then we'd want to take advantage of this gains from trade, which is something that I can write down, or I can provide like a card that only costs $1 per card, right? But the firm values it at a much higher than $1, right? And if that's true, then we might be able to, there might be a gains from trade, and we might be able to leverage something and get firms to pay a lot more. Okay? And so the general, so two sets of ideas we'll work with. One is to publicize compliance information among peer groups, and the second one is the pictures I showed you, the reward cards that help firms establish their credibility in front of their customers, as well as in front of other, people that they have business transactions with, like a bank loan officer. Okay? And we're going to cross these two treatments and also do the treatment on the basis of cluster level average performance as opposed to firm's own performance, in order to encourage more peer monitoring, peer pressure, to get firms to pressure each other and be informed about each other's performance in order to sort of jointly pay more. And so here's the basic experimental design. There's going to be ultimately 8 treatment cells. So I'll start with describing 4 cells, and then times 2 will be a third experiment that I'll describe. So the 4 treatment cells that I'll start with are basically reward cards, the pictures I showed you, versus no rewards. Those are the 2 rows. And providing some peer recognition in the form of letters. So your people around you, all your firms around you, are getting letters about how much they're paying, how much you're paying, and you're getting letters about how much they're paying and how much you're paying. Right? So everybody gets to know everybody's information in a certain neighborhood of firms. And for that cluster, you might think of, say, the same floor of a shopping mall, or you might think of 2 main streets and a set of outdoor firms that are between those 2 streets. So firms that are geographically close to each other, and also maybe engaged in the same type of business given agglomeration, so that people really understand each other's business. Okay? And so we basically cross these 2 arms. So you could either get these letters with peer recognition, or you could get reward cards, or you could get both, or you could get neither, and that's a 2x2. Okay? So with these 4 cells, though, it turns out that the information that gets revealed to you may be either positive or negative, depending on what the compliance rate is, the average compliance rate is going into it. So you might learn from the information we provide that, I'm actually paying too much, people around me are not paying. Or you might learn that I should be paying a lot more because my information is getting publicized and other people are paying. And so we then cross these 4 cells with providing baseline information about average compliance or not. And that's what creates 8 cells. For 4 times information on baseline compliance or not. Okay? And the way it's implemented is we first send out a letter to all these firms that gives them information on according to our records, are they registered, are they paying, and gives them an opportunity to correct that information. And the letters in the different treatment arms then vary with respect to how they describe the subsequent treatments. So the reward letters will say that, here's the cluster, and we'll, if you attain X, Y, or Z, you and your cluster members will receive these gold, silver, bronze cards. The peer recognition letter will say that here's your cluster members, and we'll, give you in a few weeks after you've corrected your information, we'll provide you with another letter that describes how much you're paying and how much they're paying, and it's going to be in a table where all 50 cluster members will the information will be filled in, so everybody gets to see everybody else's information. Okay, and so this gives firms an opportunity to start paying and attain some gold, silver level, or become more compliant, so that more positive information gets transmitted to their peers. But to be fair, we first wanted to give them an opportunity to correct our info before we actually start sending out the letters. Okay, and then so this graph is from our baseline data prior to any intervention. So this just shows you. So we asked in our baseline sort of firms' perceptions about what their neighbors are doing, whether they're registered, whether they're paying. And this graph just shows that there's strong positive correlation between perceived compliance and actual compliance. So there does seem to be some sort of social information, some peer information that's floating around in these markets. So firms are not completely at baseline, completely ignorant of what's going on around them. So that also helped motivate our interest in kind of doing some more social recognition. Okay. So in terms of the implementation activities, I'll go through a set of slides to explain how, the activities we did and what how the implementation was conducted, and I'll do a quick time check. And then I'll start talking about results. Okay. So the first task was actually to map out the entire area of Dhaka that falls under the Dhaka South Commissionerate. Okay. So we have a digital map of this entire area, and then next we went through and canvassed this entire area, this entire sort of set of 6 to 8 large neighborhoods of Dhaka. And we canvassed the area by car or rickshaw or by foot, however you could get into the streets or to the little alleys, right? And we identified all firms, and we identified it without even looking at or thinking about any official records. So many of these firms will not have been registered, so we would never be able to find them official records. But given the nature of our project on registration and tax payment, it was important for us to get at every single firm regardless of its registration status. And that's why this activity was sort of very intensive and took a long time. Okay? And then not only did we identify them, we wrote down the name of the firm, what it looked like, what it does, but also geocoded them. So all enumerators went with a GPS device, and every time we found a firm, we clicked on the GPS button and recorded the firm information. And of course, GPS is not that useful when you're talking about firms that are located right on top of each other on different floors, right? And so we supplemented the GPS information with also information on sort of written down on where exactly these firms are located, so that not only latitude, longitude, but also altitude is measured. Right? So this allows us to map out every single firm, right? And also allowed us to create these clusters, because we wanted to create clusters of firms on the basis of major rows that were separating firms, or firms that happen to be in the same building or the same floor of the same building, etc. Right? And this was important also because the treatments are going to be randomized at the cluster level. Okay. And then in parallel, not in parallel, after this canvassing and the sort of spatial census of all these firms was conducted, we went into the NBR records. So it's the pictures I showed you of the ledgers and the big sort of files, and we went through and digitized all that information, and we matched them to our spatial census. Okay, so we took our data, we did the mapping, we did a census of those firms, we went and did a quick survey of all those firms, and then we got the NBR registration and payment records and matched the two. Right? Of course, matching was also a difficult process because firms might go by different names, and the way the names are spelled in English and Bangla or transliterated back to English are quite different. But this also ended up taking a long time, and we had a very impressive team in Dhaka that carried out this task. So the project was in collaboration between IGC, IPA in Dhaka, and JPAL. Okay, and then based on all of this information, the matched digitized information, we then created these letters, and these letters, the information was populated by with the digitized information. So for example, on this side of the letter, if you look at your big slides, this was information on like what, according to our records, are you registered, are you paying, right? And then we described the program, and then in this particular case, this was a reward card letter that, say, treatment number 4, right? So it also gave information on exactly what has to happen for this firm to attain bronze, silver, or gold qualification. And then we mailed out these letters. So our census had about 32,000 firms, and it turned out a lot of these firms are actually quite informal. They're like vegetable sellers, roadside tea stalls that really are not VAT relevant, or even banks or some other types of businesses that are not VAT relevant. And so ultimately we identified what we thought were most likely VAT relevant firms, and attempted to mail out about 22,000 plus firms, but it turns out that some of them were still not relevant. So ultimately, we were able to deliver letters to about actually close to 17,000 firms. Okay? So the second page of the letter also described exactly who your cluster members are, and importantly, our control group, which is no reward card, no peer recognition, they also got a letter. And the reason we had them get a letter is that just the act of receiving a letter itself might change VAT compliance, and we wanted to make sure to control for that effect. Okay? And then this is an example from the peer recognition where we said that here's a table of sort of registration status, payment status that we will send out, and we will populate this information in this table about you as well as all of your cluster members. Right? So first we're giving you an opportunity to correct the information and also pay, and then we're going to send this out. Okay, and then reward cards, we've already shown you these pictures. We described to them as, so here's what the cards will look like. You could carry it to your meeting with the bank official, or you could display it. We also gave display holders in addition to the cards. You could display it in front of your customers. Okay, so ultimately 17,000 letters were delivered. It turns out that there's a huge turnover in the samples. About 5,000 firms were closed between the time we did our spatial survey to the implementation. But then they were replaced by about 2,500 new firms in this area. So there's a huge amount of turnover. There's also a lot of informality. A lot of the firms couldn't be reached because it turns out that they're a vegetable seller that just moves around. So ultimately, about 75% of the 22,000 attempted deliveries were successful. Okay? And then based on this information, we can create a lot of sort of descriptive information that was not going to be ever the subject of a rigorous economics paper, but things that the NBR really valued. So it allowed us to sort of describe the data in a variety of ways that they otherwise were not doing. So we could create, for example, heat maps of registration status, given that we have the geocoded information. We could create heat maps of payment status. And this allowed the NBR leadership to get some quick views on exactly what VAT compliance in different areas looks like. Okay? We also could create information from them by market area, like what the payment rate is, what the registration rate is, and so forth. We could provide this information by circle offices, where what are the important circles for getting revenues, and we can also provide this information for payment as well as registration, and provide this information by quarter to show them seasonal patterns and so forth. So whatever they asked for, this was we now had the data digitized to be able to provide some of this information, and this is even before looking at any treatment effects. And this itself, the descriptive part, appeared to be valuable to our government partners.